All right, how are you guys doing? Good? Was ping pong fun last night or what? I guess it wasn't fun. All right, sounds good. So welcome, and I'm here to talk to you about creating beautiful CSS animations. My name is Rami Sayar. On the agenda today is a couple of things. I'm going to go through a really quick history of animation on the web, and then I'm going to introduce CSS3 animations. I'll talk a little bit about the browser compatibility that we have for those keywords, and I'll show you some really cool animation libraries that you could use today in your projects. And finally, we'll cover some principles for beautiful animations. So I'm assuming you guys know what the web is, right? The silence is not giving me any confidence. So hopefully you guys have at least a working knowledge of HTML5 and CSS3. And if you're wondering, okay, where can I get these slides in a non-weird web format? They're actually up on slideshare.net/Rami Sayar as a PDF download that you can get right now. So my name is Rami. My job is to actually work with developers, startups, engineers, small companies, and help them build their technologies. I focus mostly on the web and the open source world. So if you're building anything with Node, Python, PHP, or trying to build with JavaScript for the web, if you have any trouble with any of our technologies or just technology in general, feel free to send me a tweet. That's my Twitter handle. It's actually not up there. It's just my name. And that's what I look like without a beard, hence why I have one now. See, that one's funny. So I come from Montreal. We were famous in the media a couple of weeks ago or months ago because we got this guy. It's like we live in Harry Potter land. I don't know about you guys, but Snowy Owl ran into a traffic camera, and that was really cool. So a short time ago, in a browser very, very close to you, geocities.com was open. The web was a wonderful place with spinning globes that were all inclusive, that worked best with Netscape, where forever everything was always under construction, a free and nice place with no pressure whatsoever, where one can be as expressive as they wanted, with no judgment at all. Rest in peace, GeoCities. Got mail. So I don't know about you guys, but I grew up with GeoCities, and that's pretty much what was my first introduction to animations on the web. It was all of these really, really awesome GIFs that you would just put everywhere, and you had absolutely no care about the design at all. You just put animations. The more animations you had, the cooler your website was. I miss those days. But they're coming back because we've got these amazing technologies that have come out, like CSS3 animations that make it really fun and easy to put these subtle animations in your websites that just make a user's experience so much better. But before that, I did want to show you a few things, and we want to talk a little bit about the history of the web. I want to show you Cameron's World. Any of you been there? Yes. This is what GeoCities was all about. This is the awesomeness. And you could scroll, you can go to Cameron's World today and actually see and find every single GIF that existed on GeoCities. And it was just glorious. It was amazing. Yes. And then there was a period in the web where there was Flash. Who started animating things with Flash? Almost everyone in the room. That's awesome. I'm sorry, but it was a very dark time for the web. And I can't believe things like this still exist. If you take a look at this is a Flash website. It's sort of the...
It's about to begin.
Okay.
You are falling deeper into the color.
Let's try to open that in a new tab. Oh. What's happening? How do I get out? I'll Control Shift F. No. Why can't I get out of full screen mode anymore? Okay, no, that's not helpful either. Chrome. At what? F11? Yes! All right, finally. All right, so here it is.
A voyage.
So who built websites like this? Okay, one person is not embarrassed to raise their hand. So this was amazing. Because it was just awesome. It took forever to load.
Welcome.
It was like funky music. Yes. I'm gonna skip the intro. And it loads again. So you can see like you've got, a bunch of menus, lots of noise. Point is, it was incredibly unhelpful for anyone who had any accessibility issues, which is why I don't like, Flash was just, as much as people were having fun with it, the end was sort of nigh. But I do want to show you some classic Flash animations before we move on. Anyone seen this one? I love this one. Yeah. We need to watch this. Thank you, MBNA, for the ads. There was a lot of fun ones. This is Animator versus Animator. Get that mouse. And then there's more. If you want to know more about the animator versus animation story, there's actually 4 more videos, in case you're curious. But things didn't end well for Flash. Any of you remember this manifesto / very angry letter at the Flash community? This was Steve Jobs. He wrote thoughts on Flash in April 2010, and he basically said that although we've had a long relationship with Adobe and Flash, it's just not going to coat the iPhone. And he wanted to favor instead open technologies. And the letter goes on, and he explains a bunch of different technical issues for why Flash was not going to be on the iPhone. And the end result was that people started moving towards HTML5. There was even folks that were, trying to occupy Flash. This was an organization whose entire mission was to go to every computer on the planet and uninstall Flash. Now, while doing so, I guess they didn't realize that they broke half the internet at the same time, but hey, revolution. So if you do want to check it out, it's pretty cool. They got a cool website, and they explain things. So I could safely say that Flash has more or less died in 2015. I don't think anyone still builds with Flash for websites, like whole websites with Flash anymore. I think we've all moved to HTML5. If you are still building with Flash, don't like hurt me. I'm sorry, but it's pretty much dead. But one more for good old times. No ads. And if you have kids, you might recognize yourself in the video. Yeah. So while Flash existed, we did have something else that was sort of happening at the same time, and it was JavaScript and HTML. Basically, it was a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There was like a bunch of techniques, and the mission was to animate text and images in the document, sort of make each one more or less move independently, just basically show off your JavaScript skills. That was the whole point of the HTML. So you would do things like embed a ticker that automatically refreshes the content, whether it's news, stock, quotes, or whatever. Maybe you had a user form to capture input, then it would verify things, or maybe some rollover buttons. But, I mean, those were legitimate uses of DHTML, like this dynamic HTML technique. But really what we wanted to do was this instead. Just pretty much this weird text that would move every once in a while. So yes, that's pretty much what happened with the HTML. So it basically was not very popular, but if you did want to see the code was ridiculous as well. Like you would take a look at this and it's just like this very unfunctional, like lots of if statements, really bad looking code. And you'd have these functions that would just shake things at random. And that was pretty much the extent of what you would do with the HTML at the time. I'm saying that there were legitimate uses for dynamic HTML, but I think most of us just wanted to do this type of stuff. So as a result, it slowly died as well. And then eventually what we did get was JavaScript and HTML5 Canvas. So Canvas I actually think is really great. It's really good for very big complex animations. So if you wanted to go back and do these very awesome videos in Flash, you would do them today with HTML5 and Canvas. You would basically be able to get pretty much the same effects, the same everything. And not to mention the JavaScript code also is a little bit complex, and it does kill your accessibility, right? Because it is JavaScript that's sort of animating a page. So if you're someone who cares about accessibility as much as I do, it's pretty hard for someone to be able to browse and read the web when it's done in Canvas, because the zoom buttons don't work particularly well, and it's just odd. And not to mention that the JavaScript code becomes quickly complex, but hey, if you want to do some animation work, HTML5 Canvas is probably a nice way to do that. And there's a couple of really awesome stuff that you could do with it. Here's an example of a CodePen sample. It's basically simulating a terrible cloth, so you're able to sort of rip like this piece of cloth apart. And you'll notice the animations are super fluid and super smooth, right? And this is running on my browser, and it's running JavaScript code. So you can do some really beautiful stuff with a very high frames per second, like it's not a problem. And now, F11 and back. So that was more or less a history of animation on the web. We started with GIFs, right? GeoCities. That was the best time, I think, honestly. It was like, I was a kid and I was just having so much fun. And then we sort of introduced Adobe in 1996. Netscape in 1997 introduced this thing called layers. That's what pretty much let us do these dynamic HTML stuff. Basically, layers was the precursor to the div that you all probably use today. So it was dropped to be renamed divs. And then it basically led to this dynamic HTML movement. But the thing with dynamic HTML, this, along with Flash and along with how websites were being built, is what sort of led to the standards movement that eventually contributed to the death of DHTML and Flash. In 2004, though, HTML5 Canvas was introduced by Apple and WebKit. And then in 2008, so really close to now, there's a couple of interesting things that are happening. 2008, there was this animated portable network graphics format that was released, so basically animated PNGs. Any of you ever use them? One person. And that's because they're not particularly well supported in all the browsers. It's a little bit odd, and few tools actually use them, so it hasn't become very popular. But in 2009, we did get the first initial draft of CSS animations, so CSS3. It's still working, actually. The people are still working on animations. It's not like it's 100% finished, but most browsers have actually implemented a lot of the features, and we'll take a look at browser compatibility towards the end. But for some really weird reason, ever since 2012, GIFs are back! It makes me so happy. So yes, for some reason, GIFs are back. So it seems like we're just going to repeat history, and then we're going to go back to Flash, I think. What do you guys think? No? Oh, God. Cool. So CSS is awesome. So let me show you what you can do with CSS animations. So introducing CSS3 animations. They're basically three different techniques: transitions, transforms, and animations. The animations last piece, that's like a narrow definition in the sense like it's the animate CSS keyword. That's what I'm referring to over there. So I'm going to start with transitions. Transitions are pretty cool. They're basically this transition property, and what you could do is you could basically use the transition keyword to sort of choose the property that you want to change, the duration for how long you want to change it, how it's going to change, and the delay. Okay, so the property itself, you can put the color, the width, the height, the background color, the padding, any of those things in that property. And really, you're just limited by whatever's in the W3C spec. So there's a lot of stuff that you can put in there. I've only selected a few of them, but you can even change things like, the font size, the font weight, and a whole bunch of stuff. But the idea of transition is you're going from some value to another value. All right, and that's where the timing function comes in to help figure out how close and how fast you should move to that value. So sort of to talk a little bit more about that, the duration is how long the animation takes in seconds. The delay is how long you wait before the animation starts. And the transition timing function is the interesting piece here. It determines how the intermediate values are calculated between going from font size 8 to font size 12. All right, and there's two classes of timing functions, and this is going to come in really handy when we talk more about the keyframes and the animate and all that other stuff. So the two classes of functions that you have, one is cubic Bezier. So if you're a Photoshop person, you probably use all this stuff. And if there's the other one, is the steps function. They look like this basically. So this is what a timing function would look like if you were to graph it out. And I'll explain what this means because it'll help you sort of understand what's actually going on. And basically, it's going from 0 to 1, and then 0 to 1. So the x-axis here is the time ratio. So how fast are we going from 0 to 1? Like in another sense, how fast are we going? Like this is like the steps in the animation. Like basically, if the duration of animation was 10 seconds. Okay, well then every one of these increments will be 1 second. All right, so where the animation is at that point is governed by the output that you get. Okay, so here what's happening is as we're getting closer to 0.25, you can see that the animation is getting closer to the value that it's trying to get. So if it was going from font size 8 to like font size 24, here it would probably be now at like font size 12. Okay, and you'll notice that in this case, around the 0.23 point right here, it hits 1. All right, so you can actually create Bezier curves where the transition goes beyond the end value. So what's happening here is that we've actually crossed our end target font size, and we've gone on to bigger font size before going back down to our end target. So this is essentially a Bezier curve. This time ratio, this is 0 to 1, is mapped to the duration of the animation. Okay, so it could be any number of seconds, but when that animation gets mapped, the output, sort of the transition that you're changing, the property that you're changing, will be mapped to this output ratio. All right. So here what we're doing is, quite simply, we're going past our end target and then going back down to it. And you can see like how fast we get there is it gets up there pretty fast, in terms of the length of the animation, and then it goes slowly back down. This is an example. It's a little bit simpler to understand. Here what's happening is we're going to hit 1 about 0.3 times the number of duration seconds into the animation. So we're actually going to stay at the end target for the rest of the animation. So it's not a step function, but it's still a Bezier curve. But here we're pretty much going to hit the maximum target, and that's it. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense to everyone. Does anyone have any questions? I'll take questions here. No? Okay. Cool. So that's what the cubic Bezier curve is. They're all continuous. So if you're a bit of a math geek like myself, these are all curves that actually exist, and they're mathematical curves. They're all continuous, and they're sometimes called easing functions. So perhaps you might have heard the term easing functions. They're roughly the same idea. So to actually go back to this curve, it's defined by 4 points, P0, P1, P2, P3. P0 and P3 are the start and end of the curve. So P0 in CSS3 is always set to 0, 0. So you always start at the beginning. You can't go backwards or whatever. And then you always end at the final state that you're going for. All right? So how you actually get this curve is based off the P1 and the P2 values. So the nice thing is you can use the cubic Bezier function in CSS to actually create your own custom Bezier curves. So here what we're doing is it's going to accelerate quite quickly to roughly the middle value of the animation. It'll slow down for about half of it, and it'll accelerate really quickly to the end target here. All right. So if this was maybe a motion animation, it basically means that it's like going to be basically, to give you an example, if it was a ball bouncing up and down, what this ball would do is as it hits the middle of where it's supposed to be, it's actually sort of slowing down, and then it accelerates towards the end. So sort of like, I'll show you examples in a second. The other cool thing is, the thing you need to know about cubic Bezier curves is that invalid curves are indeed possible, and they do cause the entire property to be ignored. So if you don't put in proper values, CSS will just ignore it. And the P1 and P2 values have to be between 0 and 1. If they're not, sorry, they don't have to be 0 and 1, but if they're outside 0 and 1, what you'll basically be generating is these bouncing effects, right? Because it'll go past where it's supposed to end, and then it'll come back. There's a really awesome cheat sheet in easings.net, and I just want to show it to you. These are pretty much all of the functions that you'll be able to find in CSS3. Basically, you can see here that this animation is just fairly simple, but let's say that we wanted something that bounces. So you can see that our little thing right here, it goes beyond where it ends, and it comes back down. You can see there. Or here's something fun. There you go. So a lot of these are actually available in CSS, in SAS, and a whole bunch of places. You can actually just program it yourself as well. So if I open it up, that's the curve. I can just copy it into my CSS and be able to get that. All right. The step function, that one's a little bit easier to explain. Basically, it's a step function. So you go from 0 to 1, depending on the time slot, and it could be left or right continuous, and the direction is specified with the start and the end. So to give you an example, this is a step function. At 0, we jump directly to 0.5. It stays at 0.5 until it hits like roughly half the animation, and then at half it jumps up to 1, and then it stays there till the end of the animation. So you can create all these step functions, and that's pretty much it. So what can you use these with? Well, you can actually use them with 2D transforms to actually transform something. And 2D transforms are pretty cool. There's basically 4 functions: skewing, scaling, rotating, and then translating, which just moves something. So to give you an example, here is a skew. This is 10 degrees. If I change this to like maybe 30 degrees, okay, you can notice that it's changing right there. It's skewing it a little bit more. By the way, this is all done with CSS3 animations. It's pretty fun. Here's a scale. So let's say that I wanted to scale this up to maybe like 3 times in width and then 1 time in height, or maybe just make it back into a square. So go to like 1, 1. If I change it, it'll transform my object into basically whatever I'm trying to scale it to. Same thing with rotation. It works with degrees, and then translate just moves it around depending on how many pixels you want. So if I move this back to like 20, it'll move it back. So what I've actually done here is I've animated the transforms code as well, so that it basically, when I refresh the code, it will apply a transform. That's just a very linear curve. You can see it doesn't bounce or anything. It just moves it from 1 to the end. And the duration is about 1 second, I think, if I remember correctly. The other cool thing is that we've also got 3D transforms. Now, depending on the browser you're using, your functionality might be a little bit different. So there's a couple of things that you need to know. Besides that, there's the actual functions themselves. So there's translate 3D, so move the object in 3D space. There's scale 3D. There's rotate the x-axis, rotate the y-axis, rotate the z-axis. Basically, because it's three-dimensional, the perspective that you're seeing, so when you're setting these values, you actually can set that. So as a user, you can be like, oh, okay, so this is where I'm at, and this is the perspective that I'm seeing. So if I'm translating something in this space, it might go off the screen, it might go farther, it'll all depend. There's a couple of other properties like transform box, transform origin, the back face visibility, so if the back of the object is visible. These are all things that you could set with your CSS 3D transforms. And you can do some pretty cool stuff. So here's an example where you can I'm just going to rotate things. So this object here is rotated 180 degrees on the x-axis, so you can see that I can still see it. But if I say like I rotate this one, the Z, okay, that's the Z-axis. If I rotate the y-axis, so that's the middle one right here, now it's back. So you can see that's the y-axis, right? So if I rotate on the y-axis, I'm doing this, right? If I rotate again, there you go. And the angle and what you actually end up seeing, if I've set the perspective to be 800 pixels and the origin to be 50% 100 pixels out. If I change this, all right, well then when I do that same rotation, I'm actually going to see something else. It's not going to look the same. The other cool part about CSS3 animation is that we've got keyframes. So keyframes define what animation looks like at each stage. And basically they're composed of three parts: the name of the animation, the stage that you're at, so basically the point in the animation where you're at. So it goes from 0 to 100%. You can also use from and to, and the properties that you're changing throughout that keyframe. So here's an example. You would just give it a name, all right, and then you'd say at 0%, top is 0, okay? But at 50%, the top of this element is actually going to be 30 pixels, and then it's going to go back to 0%. So that's handy to use with the actual animate property. So what the animate property does is it does two things. One, it assigns the keyframes to the element, and it defines how they're animated. So let's say that I want to animate a div. I would tell it what keyframe I want, how long I want it to execute. So if you remember, it's percentage-based. The keyframes are percentage-based. So you apply the percentages to the number of seconds that you want. So out of 6 seconds, the 50% point would be the 3-second mark. And then you would, depending on how fast you would get to that percentage point, is based off the easing function. All right, so you might get, it might go from 0 to 50% really quickly if you were using an easing function that wasn't linear. Okay, so that that's how you would basically set the animation. So there's a bunch of different properties. There's also a delay as well. So how long does it take to start the animation? The defaults are basically zeros, and the default easing function is just the regular ease, and that's just like more or less a linear easing function. There's a couple of other really interesting properties. One is you can tell it how many times to run the animation, and two, you can tell it the direction of the animation. Here, this one's actually pretty interesting because it's not just normal and reverse. You can also alternate. So in between every iteration, you can alternate whether you're going in the normal direction or going backwards. And then you can also alternate reverse as well. So have it go reverse first and then alternate to go normal and then stuff like that. The other cool thing is there's the fill mode that basically says how the CSS, how you should apply the CSS styles. So you can say backwards, forwards, so the direction of how to apply the CSS as well for that stage. And the other thing is the animation play state. You can set this in your JavaScript to say, hey, start running or just pause. Okay, the default is that it starts running, right? It doesn't start paused unless you change it to that. So You also have a shorthand syntax because there's a lot of properties that you should be able to set. And the shorthand goes like this: the name, the duration, the timing function, the delay, and then the iteration count. So here's an example of a pulse animation. So I've got my keyframe here, and the keyframe is basically fade out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to at 0%, the opacity is going to be 1, and at 100%, the opacity is going to be 0. Okay? The other thing that I want to do is I don't want it to just fade in and out. I want it to pulse. So to get that pulsing effect, all right, any of you, just to show you what I'm trying to get at, I'm just going to change the animation state to running. Right there. There you go. It ignored my property when I mistyped it. So it defaulted to the running. So this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get this basically pulsating effect that disappears and fades in and fades out. Right? So to get that pulse effect, I want it to scale bigger than what it's supposed to be at like the 50% mark. So I'm going to use the transform with the scale function to make it go about 20% bigger than what it is at the end. So it starts off at 1, becomes bigger, and then goes back to being 1, which is like the default size. So I can actually set up a sort of bunch of different animations in my one animation here. So I can say, hey, use both of these keyframes, pulse and fade out, and then I could set the properties for every single one. So the pulse, I want to set it to 1 second. The fade out, though, I want to take it a while for it to fade out. So I want it to basically take 5 seconds before, so you can see it pulse a few times before it fades out. And then, of course, I have a delay, so I can tell it to start the fade-out animation 5 seconds later. And you would have seen it at the beginning. But right now, because it's running for infinity, it's basically going to keep running. And then, so you can actually set the iteration count to not just be 1, 2, or 0. You can set it to be infinity. So it'll basically keep looping the animation forever. And then lastly, the running state is what tells us, if it's paused or not. So if I change this to paused, it'll pause. So you can do some really beautiful stuff with this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a really awesome CSS Solar animation. You can check out the code for this. It's up on CodePen. And basically, it's CSS animations. And you can see that we're doing some type of 3D transform here. So that things look a little bit different and they go behind other objects, and you basically do some really cool stuff. So there's Jupiter, there's Uranus, there's Neptune. There's another really cool one, the CSS3 @walker. I really like this one. It's pretty cool. The @. Woohoo! And then Stretchy Cat. This one's really well known. Basically, it'll stretch. This cat will just stretch to the size of your screen. So if I do this, there you go. Whee. Oh no. Cool. So yeah, how many of you experienced this? 99 little bugs in the code, 99 little bugs. Take one down, pass it around. 127 little bugs in the code. So why did I put that? So browser compatibility. So that's going to be an issue if you're doing these CSS3 animations. It's not too much of an issue, but if you take a look at transitions, okay, right now everyone supports transitions, including IE 10, 11, 13, Firefox 44, Chrome 48, Safari, everyone pretty much, except for Opera Mini. So that's cool. The only thing, though, is depending on what region of the world your website is going to be used in, it's not globally 100%. So it means that not every browser in the world 100% supports this. So there's people that are still running older versions of Chrome or IE that do not, do this 100%. And more crucially, though, is the unprefixed one right here. So that means that 80% of the browsers in the web will make this work without a prefix. All right, so what that means is that there's like 10% of people that do have support for this, but you do have to put the prefix in there, so the WebKit or whatnot, and basically it'll really depend on the region of the world that you're in. So 2D transforms are also a little bit better, but the unprefixed part right here, it's 74%, so you should probably be adding your prefixes. and 3D transforms is a little weird. So IE doesn't 100 support it. Edge does though. So if you're using Edge, awesome. So do the other browsers. Safari has a couple of notes as well. So you should take a look at those. iOS Safari has a couple of notes, and it depends on which version of iOS you're running. So you should definitely take a look at caniuse.com, which is where I got all these graphs. The animate property is actually fairly well supported. So you can see that pretty much most major browsers across the board support it without any notes. But let's say that I did want to target my website to pretty much everyone in the world. There's a couple of ways that you could do that. One is this plugin for PostCSS called Auto Prefixer. Basically, what PostCSS does is it parses your CSS and then it adds the vendor prefixes using the rules from that same website that I showed you, Can I Use? And if you're using Grunt or Gulp as your build chain, you can actually set this up to do it automatically. So what that means is that you could write standards compliant code like this one, and then the Gulp plugin will just make it this. So it'll take care of the prefixes like the WebKit frames, and basically it will make things a lot easier for you. The other alternative is that if you're using Sass, you can also use bourbon.io, which basically, in your Sass, instead of writing the animation or the animate keywords, you would just include animation and then pass it in all the properties. And what this plugin for Sass will do is will output every single prefix version of that animation keyword. So your code is pretty clean in the sense that you're not writing prefix code at all. You just write the standards compliant one, and then you let a tool generate all the prefixes for you. I did want to show you some really cool animation libraries that you could use today. The first one is called animate.css. It's pretty awesome and very easy to use. Basically, the way it works is that you've got the CSS thing that you would just add to an object. So let's say that I wanted to do a bounce animation. If I animate it, there's my bounce animation. But it's also got some really other random ones like the hinge, which I find really cool. So this is really easy for you to add. Now, as much as I am showing you all these cool things, I must beg you not to take us back to the Flash era. Please don't. Subtle, nice animations make everyone happy, but when your entire website is animated and I cannot browse it, it is not good. There's another library called magic.css. You can check them out. They do roughly similar things. Now, here's a tool that I feel very guilty showing you again, but I feel like I have to. This is the GeoCitiesizers, and what it does is it basically takes your website, so let's say, and then it turns it into the GeoCities version. This is good for an April Fool's joke. Yeah. Yes. Cool. So April Fool's next year. So I probably have 5 minutes left, so I won't spend too much time as much as I would like on the principles of beautiful animation. Actually, do I even have 5 minutes left? Okay. So I'll just go through the first three, or show you at least where you can read the rest. Basically, the animation principles are based off of The Illusion of Life from the Disney animation team. It's a book by Ollie Johnson and Frank Thomas, two of the animation masters at Disney during the golden age of animation. Basically, Walt Disney called them his 9 old men. Basically, the book is really awesome because it actually sort of gives you all these principles, things that you should do. I'm just going to cover maybe the first three because I think that they're the easiest to understand. Principle 1 is this idea of squashing and stretching. So you got to give a sense of weight and flexibility to your object. So let's say that you have a ball that's bouncing up and down. When it hits the ground, it should probably squash, right? And then when it bounces back up, it will stretch out again. That gives it a way more real-life appearance, at least to our eyes, and it gives a sense of weight, and it looks more realistic. So that's the first principle, the squash and stretch. The second one is anticipation. So you sort of prepare the audience to make the action look real. So if, like, the example is if I'm a dancer and I'm about to jump off the floor, I probably will bend my knees first, right? So when you see that in animation, you're sort of anticipating that something's going to happen because you see him doing something really slowly and then he jumps off, right? So that's something, and it doesn't just have to be jumping. It could be like a hand motion. It could be like an object moving into the screen, and stuff like that. So the anticipation principle is really, really handy. The other thing is staging. So let's say that I want to stage this water bottle. Okay, I'd probably want to have something like this, and then light falls down on it. Basically, what that does is it directs the person's attention to what you're trying to make important in the scene. All right, so these little effects of just having light, maybe not necessarily like a beam of light on something, but like just brighten the scene a little bit in one direction, or have things pointing or looking at one thing would make it really helpful to have these beautiful animations. So what did we learn today? We sort of went through the history of animations on the web. We talked about CSS3 animations, the transitions, the transforms, the keyframes, and the animation keywords. Talked about browser compatibility. I showed you some really cool CSS libraries. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.